April 1960. Federal Building, Manhattan. Special Agent Robert Kessler sits at his desk staring at a folder containing everything he needs to arrest Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson and send him to prison for 30 years. Evidence of narcotics trafficking. Wiretap recordings of criminal conversations. Financial documents proving money laundering. Testimony from cooperating witnesses. Everything is there. But he doesn't sign the arrest warrant. Instead, he picks up the phone and calls the man he's supposed to be investigating. The conversation is brief, professional, and completely unprecedented in FBI protocol. "Mr. Johnson, this is Special Agent Robert Kessler with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he says. "We need to talk. In private. I have information that I believe will interest you." Bumpy listens carefully on the other end of the line. He's been waiting for this call for 6 months. He's been watching the FBI surveillance. He's been aware that they were building a case. He's understood that this moment was coming. And he's been preparing for it. "When?" Bumpy asks. "Tomorrow. 8 p.m. There's a diner on Lexington Avenue. The Bluebird. Back booth. You'll know it by the waitress with red hair," Kessler says. "And if I don't show?" Bumpy asks. "Then we arrest you on Monday," Kessler replies. "We have enough to convict. 30 years in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary." The line goes dead. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something that most criminals never figure out in their entire lives, the FBI doesn't arrest people for justice. They arrest people to solve cases. And sometimes, a criminal can be far more useful to the FBI unsolved, working from the inside, feeding intelligence, than locked away in a federal prison cell. What happened over the next 7 years would rewrite how organized crime and law enforcement interact in America. It would create a secret partnership so deep that historians still argue about whether it was even real. And it would prove something fundamental about power that nobody wants to admit. The strongest position isn't having the most guns. It's being useful to the people trying to destroy you. By 1960, Bumpy Johnson had ruled Harlem for nearly 20 years. He didn't just control the numbers racket. He controlled the entire ecosystem of power in the neighborhood. His numbers operation generated millions of dollars annually. His connections reached from the beat cops on 125th Street to the judges in City Hall. He had police captains on his payroll. He had politicians who owed him favors. He had judges who looked the other way when his cases came to trial. He was untouchable. That's what everyone believed, including Bumpy himself. But in 1960, the federal government decided that Bumpy Johnson needed to be touched. The FBI, under pressure from newly appointed FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, launched what they called Operation Clean Slate, a systematic nationwide campaign to dismantle organized crime. They weren't interested in street-level dealers or small-time hustlers. They wanted the kingpins. The architects of criminal empires. The men at the very top. Bumpy Johnson was at the top of their list. Special Agent Robert Kessler, a decorated federal investigator who'd been studying organized crime for 8 years, was appointed to lead the investigation. Kessler was different from typical federal agents. He didn't believe in blunt force. He believed in understanding systems. He understood that arresting a street dealer didn't stop the drug trade. But arresting the man controlling the supply, managing the distribution, coordinating the payoffs to police and judges, that could actually disrupt the entire criminal operation. Kessler assembled a task force of 8 agents. For 6 months, they conducted comprehensive surveillance. They tapped Bumpy's phones. They followed him to meetings. They photographed him with associates. They interviewed his competitors. They built a case systematically, carefully, methodically. By early 1960, after 6 months of investigation, Kessler had accumulated evidence that was devastating. He had proof of narcotics trafficking operations. He had documentation of payoffs to police officers. He had financial records showing money laundering through legitimate businesses. He had wiretap recordings of conversations where Bumpy and his associates discussed criminal activity in explicit detail. He had witnesses, some cooperating voluntarily, some coerced through threats of prosecution. It was more than enough to convict Bumpy Johnson. It was enough to ensure he would spend decades in federal prison. Kessler walked into his supervisor's office, prepared to request an arrest warrant and present the case to a grand jury. But his supervisor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Martin Feldman, told him to wait. "Before we arrest him," Feldman said, "I want you to try something different. I want you to approach Johnson directly. Make him an offer. See if he's willing to cooperate." Kessler stared at his supervisor in disbelief. "Sir, we have a conviction case," Kessler said. "We have enough evidence to send him away for 30 years. Why would we offer him a deal?" Feldman leaned back in his chair and explained his thinking. "Because Bumpy Johnson has something that we need more than his conviction," Feldman said. "He has intelligence. Real intelligence. He negotiates with the Italian mob. He understands their structure, their power relationships, their operations. He knows which politicians they own. Which judges they've bribed. Which police officers are on their payroll. He knows about their international connections, their ties to the Sicilian mafia, their European money laundering operations, their South American cocaine suppliers." Feldman paused and let this sink in. "The five families, the Italian organized crime families that control most of crime in New York, they're our real target," Feldman continued. "We've been investigating them for years. And we know maybe 5% of what we need to actually dismantle their operation. But if we could get inside their organization, if we could understand how they really work, if we had someone feeding us intelligence from their inner circle, we could destroy them." "You want Bumpy to be an informant," Kessler said. "Not an informant," Feldman replied. "I want him to be a partner. A silent partner. He keeps running Harlem. He continues his operations. Nobody knows about our arrangement. But he feeds us intelligence about the Italian families. In return, we don't arrest him." Kessler thought about this for 3 days before responding. On the 4th day, he went to his supervisor and said, "I'll do it." Bumpy received Kessler's call at his office above Small's Paradise Jazz Club on 135th Street. His first instinct was to refuse completely. Meeting with federal agents was dangerous on multiple levels. It exposed him. It created records. It gave the FBI physical access to him, which meant they could monitor him, track his movements, identify his associates. But Bumpy had learned long ago through years of street experience to listen to proposals before making decisions. "Tomorrow. 8 p.m., Kessler said. "Bluebird Diner on Lexington Avenue. Back booth. You'll see a waitress with red hair. She'll know who you are." "And if I don't show?" Bumpy asked, though he already knew the answer. "We arrest you on Monday," Kessler said simply. "We indict you on Tuesday. We convict you within a year. You spend 30 years in federal prison. You'll be an old man when you get out, if you get out alive." The line went dead. Bumpy sat in his office for an hour thinking about this. Going to meet the FBI was a calculated risk. But not going meant certain prosecution, certain conviction, certain decades in prison. At least if he showed up, he could hear what they wanted. He could assess the situation. He could try to understand what angle Kessler was playing. He could potentially negotiate terms that might protect him. So Bumpy decided to go. He told no one where he was going. He didn't bring protection. He walked into the diner alone at 7:55 p.m., ordered a coffee, and sat in the back booth like Kessler had instructed. A waitress with red hair brought him the coffee. 2 minutes later, Special Agent Robert Kessler sat down across from him. Kessler was a tall, thin man in his mid-40s with gray eyes that didn't show emotion easily. He carried a leather briefcase and had the careful, measured demeanor of someone trained in interrogation. Kessler opened the briefcase and slid photographs across the table. The first photo showed Bumpy leaving a policy bank in East Harlem. The second showed him meeting with a known narcotics supplier. The third showed him collecting money from a street-level runner. Each photograph was dated, time-stamped, and professionally documented by FBI surveillance. "We have 200 more where these came from," Kessler said quietly, sliding more photographs across. "We have recordings from wiretaps of your phone conversations. We have testimony from 3 of your associates who we've flipped. We have bank records showing money laundering. We have a case, Mr. Johnson. A solid case. The kind of case that results in conviction." Bumpy looked at the photographs carefully, studying them without emotion. Then he looked back at Kessler. "If you have all that," Bumpy said, "then why are we having coffee?" Kessler smiled slightly, not a friendly smile, but the smile of someone who respects another person's intelligence. "Because we don't actually want to arrest you," he said. "We want to use you." Kessler pulled out a second folder from his briefcase. This one contained photographs of Italian mobsters. Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Carlo Gambino, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bonanno, and others whose faces Bumpy recognized from the underworld. "These men control most of organized crime in New York," Kessler said. "The Italian Mafia. The 5 families. They have their hands in everything: gambling, loan sharking, labor unions, construction, narcotics, heroin distribution, international money laundering. We've been investigating them for years. And despite having more resources than any organized crime task force in America, we know maybe 5% of what we need to know to actually dismantle their operation." Kessler leaned forward. "But you negotiate with these men," Kessler continued. "You have dealings with them. You understand their structure, their power relationships, their operations. You know which families are aligned, which are competing, which are negotiating. You have intelligence that we literally cannot get any other way. No amount of surveillance, no number of wiretaps, no number of undercover agents can give us what you already know." "You want me to be an informant," Bumpy said. "No," Kessler replied. "I want you to be a partner. A silent partner. Here's the offer: you keep running Harlem exactly as you have been. You continue your operations. You make your money. You control your territory. Nobody, and I mean nobody, knows about our arrangement except me, my supervisor, and you. In return, you feed us intelligence about the Italian families. You tell us about their operations, their relationships, their money flows, their vulnerabilities. You help us understand how they work. And we use that intelligence to prosecute them." Bumpy understood the proposal immediately. The benefit was obvious: he stayed free, he continued operating, he avoided prison. The cost was equally obvious: he would be dependent on Kessler's discretion for the rest of his life. "What happens if I refuse?" Bumpy asked. "Then we arrest you Monday morning," Kessler said. "We indict you Tuesday. You go to trial within 6 months. You're convicted within a year. You spend 30 years in federal prison." Bumpy sat with this for several minutes, not speaking, just thinking. Finally, he leaned forward. "I'll do it," Bumpy said. "But on 3 conditions." Kessler nodded. "First," Bumpy said, "this relationship is completely compartmentalized. You're the only FBI agent I deal with. No other agents. No task forces. No bureaucratic machinery. It's just you and me. If I find out there are other people involved, if I find out the information is being passed around, the deal is off immediately." "Agreed," Kessler said. "Second, I operate freely in Harlem. No interference. No arrests of my associates. No charges against people in my organization. I control my territory completely. The FBI focuses on the Italian families. Harlem is mine. Agreed, Kessler said. Third, Bumpy continued, you protect me. If someone comes after me, if there's a credible threat to my life, you use your resources to eliminate that threat. That's part of our arrangement. I give you intelligence, you protect me. Kessler hesitated on this one. We can do that informally, he said finally. If we become aware of a credible threat against you, we can take action. We can arrest the people involved, prevent the assassination. But I can't promise formal protection. That would create records. That would expose the arrangement. Informal is fine, Bumpy said. As long as you're actually listening and actually willing to move when necessary. They shook hands across the table in the Bluebird Diner on a Thursday evening in April 1960. The partnership was made. The early months were tense and required discipline. Bumpy had to learn how to communicate with Kessler without being obvious about it. They couldn't meet in public regularly. They couldn't have phone conversations that lasted more than a few minutes. They couldn't create visible patterns that other criminals or counterintelligence investigators might notice. They developed a system of dead drops, hidden locations where Kessler could retrieve intelligence documents without them ever having to meet in person. A mailbox behind a building in East Harlem. A locker at Penn Station. A trash can in Central Park. A key taped behind a building. The locations changed constantly, following a code that only Bumpy and Kessler understood. Bumpy would leave information in these locations, written documents, sometimes photographs, sometimes just notes with details about conversations he'd overheard or deals he'd learned about. Kessler would retrieve them within hours and pass the intelligence up the chain of command. By October 1960, just 6 months into the arrangement, Bumpy delivered information that prevented a major Italian mob war. Through his associates and his street network, Bumpy had learned that Carlo Gambino was planning to eliminate Frank Costello as part of a power struggle within the 5 families. Gambino wanted control of the Luciano family, which Costello currently headed. If Gambino moved against Costello, it would trigger a war between families. If that war happened, it would destabilize the entire New York underworld. It would create massive violence. It would draw police attention. It would threaten Bumpy's carefully maintained control of Harlem. Bumpy passed this information to Kessler. Kessler used it strategically. He didn't arrest anyone. He didn't make threats directly. Instead, he arranged for both Gambino and Costello to understand that the FBI was aware of their power struggle. The message was subtle but clear: a war between the families would not be tolerated. Federal law enforcement would intervene. Investigations would intensify. Prosecutions would follow. The threat of federal intervention was enough to prevent the conflict from escalating into open warfare. Gambino and Costello reached a negotiated settlement instead. The power structure of the 5 families was adjusted, but through negotiation rather than violence. This is the moment when Bumpy realized what was actually happening in the arrangement. He wasn't just giving the FBI information about organized crime. He was using the FBI as a tool to manage organized crime in his territory. By feeding intelligence to Kessler, he was giving federal law enforcement the information they needed to prevent the kind of wars and territorial disputes that threatened his control of Harlem. Bumpy was, in effect, outsourcing conflict resolution to the FBI. And Kessler understood this dynamic perfectly. At their next meeting, Kessler said, "You're right. We're not just investigating organized crime. We're managing it. We're using intelligence and the threat of prosecution to prevent the kind of violence that would create political problems for us. And you're helping us do that. In return, you get to run Harlem without federal interference." By 1961, the arrangement had deepened significantly. Bumpy began providing detailed financial intelligence. He explained how the Italian families were moving money internationally, which banks they were using, which legitimate businesses were fronts for criminal money. He identified corrupt officials in law enforcement and government who were on the mob's payroll. He provided details about international organized crime connections, the Sicilian mafia, the French connection drug suppliers, the South American cocaine operations. Kessler used this intelligence systematically. Over months and years, the FBI would indict specific individuals and prosecute them based on intelligence that Bumpy had provided. The Italian families knew they were being investigated, but they never knew the source of the leaks. Some suspected there was a mole at high levels of their organization. Some suspected Bumpy. But there was no proof, no evidence, just an increasingly effective FBI operation that seemed to anticipate their moves. In 1962, Bumpy's information helped the FBI identify and arrest a major narcotics trafficker who was supplying heroin to New York street dealers. The arrest disrupted drug supplies for 6 months and prevented hundreds of drug deals that would have otherwise happened. In 1963, Bumpy provided intelligence that led to the conviction of a corrupt police captain who'd been taking bribes from organized crime for a decade. In 1964, Bumpy gave Kessler information about labor union corruption that the FBI used to prosecute union officials who were connected to the mob. Each piece of intelligence was valuable. Each one contributed to the larger strategy of disrupting organized crime without directly threatening Bumpy's control of Harlem. The system was working perfectly. But the arrangement also created profound vulnerability. Bumpy was now completely dependent on Kessler's continued discretion. If Kessler was transferred, reassigned, fired, or died, a new agent might not honor the arrangement. If there was a political shift in FBI leadership, the priorities might change. If the wrong person discovered the partnership, everything could collapse. More dangerously, Bumpy was now engaged in a relationship where he was effectively helping the federal government prosecute people who were technically his competitors and allies in the underworld. The Italian families wouldn't tolerate this if they ever found out. In 1963, Bumpy had to make a critical decision. He was meeting with Vito Genovese, one of the most powerful Italian mobsters in New York. Genovese was paranoid. He'd spent years investigating leaks in his organization. He'd purged men he suspected of being informants. And now he was confronting Bumpy with a direct question. Vito Genovese believed someone was feeding the FBI information from inside the organizations. Deals were exposed before they happened. Moves were anticipated too precisely. Someone had to be talking. Bumpy Johnson was never suspected. He wasn't part of the Italian family's hierarchy. He was Harlem's independent power, connected, respected, but separate. When Genovese voiced his concerns, Bumpy calmly redirected them. Perhaps there was no informant at all. Perhaps the FBI had simply become smarter, led by agents more capable than those Genovese had faced before. Genovese launched an internal investigation. It led nowhere. Tension spread between families, accusations faded, and no source was exposed. Bumpy survived through perfect discipline, no paper trail, no predictable meetings, no visible patterns. But the incident taught him a hard truth: this arrangement could not last forever. In 1964, Bumpy was arrested on a minor drug charge. He immediately understood why. His FBI contact, Special Agent Robert Kessler, had allowed it. If Bumpy were never arrested, he would appear protected. And protection was suspicious. Occasional arrests made him look like any other criminal struggling with the law. Bumpy confronted Kessler. Kessler called it protection, not control. Bumpy wasn't convinced, but he understood the necessity. By 1967, the partnership began to fracture. A federal prosecutor discovered that a high-level informant was supplying intelligence on the Italian families and demanded the source be revealed. Kessler refused. The conflict reached the FBI director, who ruled that the informant's identity would remain sealed. Bumpy was simply too valuable. Still, the damage was done. Bumpy saw how fragile his safety was, dependent on shifting politics inside the system. He pulled back. He spoke less. He prepared himself. Later that year, he was arrested again, this time on serious charges. The FBI was retreating. Bumpy chose survival. He accepted a plea deal, served 5 years, and walked away diminished but alive. The silent partnership lasted 7 years. It reshaped organized crime in New York without ever being publicly acknowledged. Bumpy Johnson understood what most criminals never do: power isn't about fighting the system. It's about knowing how to use it. And surviving.